The fire had almost burned out. Beyond its fading glow, the darkness was alive with sounds. Branches snapping, insects humming, distant growls rolling through the night. A small group of ancient humans sat shoulder to shoulder, eyes fixed on the shadows. One child suddenly pointed toward the trees. Everyone turned at once. No one spoke. No one could. Yet somehow every person understood exactly what that gesture meant. Move. Within seconds, the group quietly gathered their few belongings and slipped away from the campsite, disappearing into the darkness before anything emerged from the forest. By sunrise, enormous predator tracks surrounded the place where they had slept only hours earlier. Somehow, they had sensed the danger in time. But how? Today, we rely on thousands of words every single day. We explain, argue, warn, teach, and plan with language so effortlessly that it's hard to imagine life without it. Yet for most of human history, fully developed language didn't exist. There were no conversations around the campfire, no detailed instructions, and no stories passed down with carefully chosen words. And yet our ancestors survived ice ages, escaped predators, hunted dangerous animals, cared for children, and crossed entire continents. Think about that for a second. How do you organize a hunt without speaking? How do you warn someone about an invisible danger? How do you teach a child everything they need to know if words haven't been invented yet? The deeper you look, the stranger the mystery becomes. Because the secret to surviving before language may not have been the absence of communication at all. It may have been something far more remarkable. The simplest answer seems almost obvious. Ancient humans survived because they didn't need language the way we do. Instead, they depended on something far older: observation. Picture a child growing up tens of thousands of years ago. Long before learning to shape complex sounds, that child was constantly watching. They watched adults gather food without touching poisonous berries. They watched hunters freeze the instant birds burst into the air. They watched the tribe avoid certain valleys after heavy rain and return to familiar waterholes when the dry season arrived. Little by little, survival became a pattern rather than a lesson. Every movement carried meaning. Every routine was a silent demonstration. Instead of listening to long explanations, children learned by copying what successful adults did day after day. Even today, researchers have found that people can imitate surprisingly complicated tasks simply by observing others. From making stone tools to preparing food, careful imitation often works better than lengthy verbal instructions. Watching someone succeed, or fail, can teach lessons that words sometimes cannot. That helps explain how early humans mastered skills that took years to perfect. It also explains why groups stayed close together. Living side by side meant every meal, every hunt, and every mistake became another opportunity to learn without speaking. At first glance, the mystery seems solved. Watch, copy, survive, simple enough. But then archaeologists uncovered evidence that didn't quite fit this picture. Ancient humans weren't just repeating familiar routines. They were planning journeys across unknown landscapes, coordinating hunts involving dozens of people, and adapting to environments none of them had ever seen before. Observation alone could explain imitation. It couldn't fully explain imagination. And that raised a far bigger question. If words were still limited, what invisible system allowed entire groups to think and act together? For a long time, many researchers assumed that language appeared first, and only then did humans become capable of working together in large, organized groups. It seemed logical. After all, how else could dozens of people coordinate a dangerous hunt or migrate across unfamiliar territory without detailed conversations? But the evidence began telling a different story. Archaeologists discovered ancient hunting sites where massive animals had been surrounded and driven into natural traps. These weren't random encounters. They required careful timing, people positioned in different locations, and everyone reacting at exactly the right moment. A single mistake could send a frightened herd charging in every direction, or worse, straight toward the hunters themselves. Picture that scene. Dust fills the air, hooves thunder across the ground. Some hunters remain hidden while others suddenly appear, pushing the animals toward a narrow cliff or steep ravine. Every person seems to know precisely when to move. It's hard to imagine all of that happening through spoken instructions alone. Then came another surprising clue. Modern studies of hunter-gatherer societies reveal that much of their communication during hunts is intentionally silent. Hunters rely on eye contact, subtle hand signals, body posture, facial expressions, and an almost instinctive awareness of one another's movements. Speaking too much can scare prey long before anyone gets close enough to act. That discovery changed the question entirely. Perhaps speech wasn't the foundation of cooperation. Perhaps cooperation had already evolved through silent communication, with language arriving later to build upon abilities humans had been refining for thousands of generations. If that's true, then our ancestors weren't surviving despite the lack of language. They were surviving because they had mastered another form of communication that modern humans often overlook. But what exactly was that invisible language, and could traces of it still be shaping the way we understand one another today? That question led researchers somewhere unexpected, not into an ancient cave, but into a modern laboratory. They wanted to test a surprisingly simple idea. Could complete strangers solve problems together without using language at all? If speech was truly the foundation of cooperation, then taking it away should cause teamwork to collapse. At first, the results seemed predictable. Volunteers struggled during the opening moments. They hesitated, misread one another's intentions, and often made the wrong decisions. Without words, even basic tasks felt frustrating. But then something changed. As the experiments continued, participants slowly stopped relying on speech they no longer had. Instead, they began noticing tiny details they had previously ignored. A glance lasted half a second longer. A shift in posture signaled hesitation. The direction of someone's eyes became a silent instruction. Gradually, groups that had seemed completely disorganized started moving with remarkable coordination. Researchers hadn't expected the transformation to happen so quickly. Around the same time, archaeologists uncovered another clue buried far beneath the earth. Stone tools separated by thousands of years showed gradual improvements rather than sudden leaps. The craftsmanship became more precise, more consistent, and more sophisticated across generations. Somehow, complex techniques had been preserved long before anyone can confidently say fully developed language existed. Think about what that means. Entire communities were passing down knowledge that required patience, precision, and practice, without relying on long verbal explanations. Their real advantage may not have been speaking. It may have been an extraordinary ability to observe, imitate, and understand one another in ways modern people rarely notice. That discovery answered one mystery, but it created another. If silent communication was already powerful enough to teach skills, coordinate hunts, and strengthen entire communities, then why did language evolve at all? What problem was it solving that silence never could? In the late 1960s, an American researcher named Sue Savage Rumbaugh began asking a question that sounded almost impossible. What if the roots of human communication existed long before human language itself? To explore that mystery, she spent years observing our closest living relatives, great apes, not just to see whether they could learn symbols, but to understand how they communicated when no words were available. One moment stood out. A young bonobo noticed that another member of its group had wandered into a dangerous situation. There was no spoken warning, no sentence, no carefully constructed message. Instead, the bonobo quickly changed its posture, fixed its gaze, and made a series of deliberate gestures. Almost instantly, the other animal understood. It stopped, turned around, and moved to safety. The exchange lasted only seconds. Yet it carried everything that mattered: attention, intention, understanding, and action. Watching scenes like this, researchers realized they weren't witnessing random behavior. They were seeing communication built from shared experience rather than vocabulary. Meaning wasn't trapped inside words. It existed in relationships, trust, and the ability to read another mind through movement alone. Imagine our own ancestors around a campfire tens of thousands of years ago. A parent catches a child's eye and silently points toward fresh footprints in the mud. No explanation follows. None is needed. The child already knows what those tracks mean because countless moments like this have happened before. That quiet exchange may have carried more survival value than an entire conversation. The more scientists studied communication beyond speech, the more one possibility emerged. Perhaps language didn't appear because humans suddenly became intelligent enough to talk. Perhaps it appeared because silent understanding had finally reached its limits. But where exactly was that limit? And what forced humanity to cross it? By now, the mystery had grown far beyond ancient humans. The same silent patterns appeared almost everywhere researchers looked. Watch a pack of wolves preparing for a hunt. There is no leader shouting commands across the forest. One wolf changes direction, another quietly spreads outward, and within moments, the entire pack adjusts. Each animal seems to anticipate what the others are about to do before it actually happens. Or picture a flock of thousands of birds twisting through the sky. They turn almost simultaneously, creating breathtaking shapes that ripple across the air. There is no central commander. No one bird controls the movement. Yet together, they behave as if they share a single mind. Humans aren't unique in this respect, but they are unique in what they built upon it. Across every continent, archaeologists have uncovered signs of early communities solving remarkably similar problems. From Ice Age Europe to the plains of Africa and the coastlines of Australia, small groups developed shared hunting strategies, cared for injured members who could no longer contribute, and passed down tool-making traditions over countless generations. These societies were separated by oceans, climates, and thousands of years, yet they repeatedly relied on the same invisible foundation: cooperation before conversation. Think about that for a moment. Civilization may not have begun with the first spoken sentence. It may have begun the moment humans learned to trust one another's intentions without needing every thought explained. That idea changes the entire story. Language wasn't replacing silence. It was expanding a system that had already proven powerful enough to help humans survive almost every environment on Earth. But if silent understanding was so successful across species, across continents, and across thousands of generations, then one mystery still remained. What happened that finally made silence alone no longer enough? Of course, if silent communication was enough, every human group should have succeeded. But history tells a more complicated story. Archaeologists have uncovered ancient settlements that were abandoned almost as quickly as they appeared. Some communities struggled to adapt when they entered unfamiliar landscapes filled with new predators, strange climates, or plants they had never encountered before. The silent knowledge that worked perfectly in one environment suddenly became unreliable in another. Imagine arriving in a land where every animal behaves differently, every season changes at unfamiliar times, and every berry could either feed your family or poison them. Observation still mattered, but now experience was missing. There are rare examples among modern isolated groups that hint at the same challenge. When communities become separated from neighboring groups for long periods, specialized knowledge can gradually disappear as older generations die. Skills that once seemed permanent can fade surprisingly quickly if they are no longer demonstrated or reinforced. Researchers have also noticed another fascinating exception. Silent communication works best among people who already share experience. Families, hunting partners, and lifelong companions can understand gestures that would completely confuse strangers. Without that shared history, the same glance or movement suddenly loses its meaning. That may explain why early human groups remained relatively small for so long. Silence created strong communities, but it struggled to connect different communities. And as humans spread farther across the world, meeting unfamiliar people more often than ever before, they faced a challenge that observation alone couldn't solve. Perhaps the next great leap in human survival wasn't learning how to understand those closest to us. It was learning how to understand complete strangers. So how did ancient humans survive before language? The answer is that they probably didn't, at least not in the way we usually imagine. The real breakthrough wasn't surviving without language. It was surviving with something that came before it. A remarkably sophisticated system of shared attention, imitation, trust, emotion, memory, and silent communication that had been evolving for hundreds of thousands of years. In other words, language wasn't humanity's starting point. It was humanity's upgrade. Think back to every clue we've uncovered. Children learned by watching instead of listening. Hunters coordinated through movement rather than conversation. Knowledge passed from one generation to the next through repeated demonstration. Communities survived because every individual understood the same patterns long before those patterns had names. Words didn't create cooperation. Cooperation created the conditions that made words useful. That completely changes the story. Instead of asking, how did humans survive before language? Perhaps the better question is, what kind of minds were capable of inventing language in the first place? The answer wasn't bigger brains alone. It was minds that had already learned to imagine what someone else was thinking. They could predict another person's actions, recognize intentions from a simple glance, and trust shared experiences built over years of living together. Language simply made those invisible thoughts easier to exchange. Once that happened, everything accelerated. Ideas no longer had to be demonstrated every single time. A hunter could describe an animal no one else had seen. An elder could warn children about dangers beyond the horizon. Plans could stretch into the future instead of existing only in the present moment. Knowledge could travel farther than the people who first discovered it. That was the true revolution. Language didn't teach humans how to survive. It allowed survival itself to become cumulative. Every generation inherited not only tools and traditions, but also stories, warnings, strategies, and discoveries collected over countless lifetimes. Humanity stopped beginning from scratch. And perhaps that's why our ancestors eventually accomplished something no other species ever did. Not because they learned to speak, but because they learned to share entire worlds that existed only inside their minds. Now return to that fading campfire. The forest is still dark. The distant growl is still echoing through the trees. A child quietly points toward the shadows, and without a single spoken word, the entire group rises and disappears into the night. By morning, predator tracks surround the abandoned campsite. They survived once again. It almost looks like magic, but it wasn't. It was the product of countless generations learning to notice, to trust, and to understand one another long before they could explain themselves with sentences. Those silent moments became the invisible bridge between instinct and civilization. Sometimes we imagine language as the invention that made us human. Perhaps it was the other way around. Perhaps humanity had already begun the moment our ancestors learned to share attention, pass on experience, and see the world through someone else's eyes. Words simply gave that ancient ability a voice. Every conversation you have today, every story you tell, every idea you pass to another person traces its roots back to those quiet campfires, where survival depended not on speaking louder, but on understanding deeper. And maybe that's the greatest mystery of all. Long before humans learned how to talk, they had already learned the one skill civilization could never exist without: the extraordinary ability to build a single shared reality inside many different minds.